All right. So continuing with this riveting account of environmental hazards, let's talk about the drinking water. Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 regulates and protects public drinking water. There's a lot of to-do, people going out and buying bottled water before the storm here in Greensboro. Did anybody try to buy bottled water and couldn't find it anywhere? I know that there were a bunch of stores that were completely sold out, and of course, what came out in the paper soon after that was that your drinking water is very likely to be continuing to flow from your faucets regardless of what happens with Florence, because they have, you know, backup systems and so forth that even if they have a loss of power, they can still pump water to the community. So you don't have to worry about your drinking water. I do know some people that only drink water if it comes out of a bottle, which is kind of ironic since a lot of places just take tap water and fill it up. But if you're dealing with a home in Greensboro, you can pretty much be assured that the water is going to be safe, at least relatively so. But if you have a home out in the county or outside of the municipality, then you probably are dealing with somebody with a well. And you want to make sure that you have the well tested, the water tested, because of all the things that we've already talked about. You have contaminants that end up, you know, if there's manure that gets it soaked into the groundwater, you're not worried about drinking manure. What you're worried about is the bacteria that have grown because of that manure, or the bacteria that have grown because of the other contaminants. There's also various minerals that can get into the water that you don't want in there. So all of that's a good idea to make sure that you have your well water tested to make sure that you don't have problems. One of the problems that can come up is when you have underground storage tanks. So these storage tanks were used for many, many years in residential homes to store fuel oil for their heaters. So if you're selling a house that was built back in the 50s or 60s or before, it may very well be that it had a storage tank buried under the ground next to the house. And so they were getting their heating not from natural gas, but from oil. And built before the 1970s, you want to look for signs that there's a buried oil tank. Because most people, if you know, maybe somebody bought a house in 1990 and you go to sell their house today, but it's an older house, and you say, well, you know, did they have an oil tank here? Oh no, we've never seen any sign of an oil tank. We have natural gas, it's no problem. Well, what was heating it before the natural gas was put in? One of the ways to find out is to call one of the natural gas companies and find out when was natural gas installed in the house, because if it was after the house was built, they were using something before that. Maybe it was coal, but probably not. So you want to make sure that you scope it out a little bit. And oftentimes this is what you'll see. I don't know if you can see this very well, but these are two little pipes sticking out above the ground. One of those pipes was the filler hose, and the other was the exhaust pipe. So as they filled it up, the gases would come out the other pipe. And if you see these two pipes sticking out of the ground, you can almost guarantee that there is a oil tank underneath the ground somewhere. Now maybe it's completely empty, been emptied and cleaned out, and it's no problem whatsoever. But if your luck is anything like mine, it might not be. And in fact, these tanks were not built to today's standards, and these metal tanks begin to disintegrate, and the oil ends up in the ground. and that becomes a serious problem. Now, some people took care of this problem many years ago. They cut the pipe off just below the ground and they put a little dirt over that, and they said, see, no oil tanks, no problem, right? So you need to, explore a little bit. So if you go under the house and there's a pipe sticking out, like out of the wall underneath the house, that's the old filler pipe, that might give you a clue. Now, not everybody crawls under the house as a real estate broker, but in any case, you want to be aware of this, particularly with older houses, because you might have a situation like this, where you have a buried oil tank that needs to be taken out of the ground. Now, they don't always have to be taken out of the ground if they've been cleaned out or what have you, but if you've got a leaking oil tank, they need to remove the oil and get that tank out of there before it corrodes anymore. If you're lucky, they had an oil tank that was above ground. That's like a gift. If you see that, you're like, oh, thank God. But this is oftentimes the situation. The problem is that it leaks into the ground, and then it seeps out into the, under the ground, and ends up soaking around the tank, and maybe even as far as the next door neighbor's house, right? Or it gets into the well water, or it gets into your neighbor's well water. And so that's a problem. If it leaks underneath the house, then you got a different kind of problem, because you can't just dig all the dirt out from underneath the house, right? The house would just collapse. So most people are not aware of the fact that once they dig that soil out that's soaked in oil, they can't just take it to the landfill and dump it, because it's contaminated. They have to take it to a special processing plant. And I just realized I didn't turn that on.
Sure, I had it.
Did you hit it? They take it to a processing plant and burn off the oils, but that's expensive. And it takes truckloads of dirt. They dig this tank out and they dig out all that contaminated dirt. We're talking about multiple truckloads of dirt, and it's very expensive. Tens of thousands of dollars to take care of this. Well, years ago, the state of North Carolina, in their wisdom, developed a fund to help buyers and sellers with this situation. And so if you discovered that you've got a leaking oil tank in your backyard, they would help you to be able to pay for remediating that. And maybe 90–95% of the cost. So instead of costing you $30,000, it might only cost you $3,000 to take that oil tank and the dirt and everything else with it. But about 4 years ago, maybe more, the North Carolina legislature decided we need to save money for the taxpayers, and they stopped funding that fund. And so now there is no money for you if you discover an oil tank in your backyard. And this has really become a problem. I told you that I'm on the real estate board, and we've been to Raleigh numerous times the last few years, lobbying legislators to put that fund back into play. Because what really is happening is people are stuck. They can't afford to remediate it. The buyers don't want to buy a house that has contamination, and so they end up not being able to sell property. It's really a serious problem. We're talking about, $30 grand. That's a chunk of change. So,
I have a situation like that in New Jersey.
Oh yeah.
And before we could sell our home, we ended up spending about $50,000.
$50 grand. Oh, this makes you sick.
$50,000 to do it. And what happened there is that we put our home on the market, and of course the oil tank was leaking.
Of course.
But it was leaking 20 years ago, probably.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, we wasn't thinking, hey, but we bought a home. And to get out of it, then they had to keep coming back to test it.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where all the dirt and taking it away, it just makes you sick.
Mm.
In New Jersey, they're fun, they didn't have any money either to help
Mhm.
out. And it just, it's just a sight.
Regardless of your political stripe, there are some things that are worth collecting taxes on. This might be one of them, to try to make sure that we don't have basically homeowners that are just stuck with their houses. Because most of us don't have 50 grand laying around to do this. And of course, you didn't design that house or plan to have an oil tank in the backyard or any of that, right?
No, not at all, and, because we were thinking that, when we had it tested, we were thinking that, okay, they would just remove it, because we had converted to gas,
Mm-hmm.
and we were thinking, okay, so they'll just remove it, well, it wasn't that easy.
Yeah, not just the tank, but you gotta get rid of all that dirt and everything
They had came out, tested it, and then that's when they said, oh, it's
Yeah.
leaking,
else.
and it's leaking.
Yeah,
It's this part, that part, and so you're
Yep.
looking at from this corner of the house to the back of the house.
yeah.
And it was like our driveway going into the garage.
Yeah.
So it went from the front to the back.
Hmm.
It's-
That's a nightmare. So if you're helping buyers, you're gonna look around the house, make sure that you have, check this out, make sure that there isn't a tank, ask questions, talk to the neighbors, whatever it takes, right? Because your duty is to discover and disclose. Would it be a material fact to have a buried oil tank? You bet, right? Now, sometimes you can fool you if they cut the pipes off and there's not any evidence, it doesn't smell like petroleum in the backyard, then you can be fooled pretty easily. But some people have gone in and cut the top off of the tank and cleaned it out and then filled it up with a material that, kind of keeps whatever is left in there from seeping out, and then rebury the tank. But in any case, you want to make sure that you do things properly, and so you don't end up having a cloud on the title. One of my clients had this situation. They went in, they took the tank out, they scooped out truckloads of dirt, but some of the oil seeped under the house. And they couldn't dig that out because it would have collapsed the house. So they ended up putting a note on the deed that basically left a cloud on the deed saying there is contamination under the house. But it was in the city, and of course there's restrictions about putting wells and so forth around this house, but since it was city water and city sewer, they didn't have to worry about that. And it was still saleable. Even though, so they did everything they could, they just couldn't get it all. But because it was in the city, it wasn't quite as much of a worry as it would have been if it had been out in the country where you were digging wells. So, landfill, or on the east side, there's a big landfill. If you haven't lived here but a short time, you may not have known there was a good deal of controversy about reopening the landfill. If you live next to a landfill, you know it, right? It stinks. There's all kinds of other issues related to it. You have, if it's not properly lined, you can have stuff getting into the groundwater. You can have rodents, all sorts of things like that. So knowing proximity to landfills, know where the landfills are. If you're selling property, make sure you make sure that you're informing your buyers and sellers. So when you have a landfill, if it's properly done, they now line them with plastic so that stuff doesn't go into the groundwater. Then they pile the trash in there, and then they put a layer of dirt. Then they pile more trash and a layer of dirt. Have any of you ever been to a landfill? Yeah? A couple of you? I'll tell you what, it's pretty amazing. When I lived in Houston, I was teaching middle schoolers. And we went on a visit to the landfill. Now, Houston is about as hilly as this room, right? So you're driving along in Houston, and then all of a sudden there is a mountain in front of you, and you're like, wow, there's a mountain just outside of Houston. Well, it turns out that was the landfill. It was, ginormous, this huge mountain of trash. And at the very top where they were still putting stuff in there were seagulls. I never could figure that out. The seagulls just love hanging around the landfill. But anyway, when they're all done, they cover it all up with several feet of soil, and it just looks like, the hills are alive with the sound of music. If you've ever seen, Maria on top of the mountain right there. It's beautiful. It has lots of grass growing on it. And that caps it. I mean, it keeps stuff from, being visible, and also just keeps it all together there. So making sure that we don't have issues with leakage. Sometimes you'll see they'll have pipes sticking out of the ground around landfills, because as the trash deteriorates, it gives off gas, which is actually methane gas that can be burned. So you can actually mine the gas from the landfill and pipe it somewhere where it can be collected, and they can sell that methane gas, use it for fuel for something. I don't know if we do that here, but certainly important. Groundwater testing, as I said, you do want to have your well tested, but there's also ground testing itself, what we call perking for a sewer system. If you have a septic system for a house, for those of you that have always lived in the city, if you live out in the country, you don't have a city sewer system. They actually have a tank where the stuff from your house goes into this tank, and the bacteria eats it up. And then what's left is basically a sludge and some water, and that goes out these lines, septic lines, into the soil. I've had like 4 septic tests in the last month for buyers that were buying houses, and the guy that does the septic inspections is totally into it. He's just like the master of poo, and he's got cameras that go into the septic lines, and he's like, you got to see this. This is awesome. And he's like going through, and you got this little camera set up, and you can see as he snakes through the lines, and you can see where the poo is built up in a certain spot because there's some problem, a root or something that's gotten into the line. In one case, the septic line, the sewer line actually from the house to the septic tank went up like this. So it came out of the house and then back up to the septic tank. So you had basically stuff pooling at the bottom down here, and he was like, no, you're supposed to have a drop like this so that gravity feeds the septic tank. So we had to tell the sellers, you need to fix that so it's got a nice smooth drop. The most common lawsuit for Allen Tate Company is over septic systems. So you have a house that you built, and when you had it built, it was a 3-bedroom house, and you had a 3-bedroom septic system put in. But then your family grew, and so you decided to add on another bedroom to the back of the house. Now you have a 4-bedroom house. But what kind of septic system do you have? You have a 3-bedroom septic system. And so what happens is the real estate agent comes out to your house and says, oh, this is a great house. How many bedrooms do you have? 4 bedrooms. Oh, okay, 4 bedrooms. Yeah, okay, I got that. And how many baths? 3 bathrooms. Okay, 3 bathrooms. That's wonderful. I see that you added on that extra. That's awesome. Yeah, that's really great. But they never check out the septic system. So when a house is built, the public health department actually issues a permit for a septic system. If the permit says 3 bedrooms and the house says 4 bedrooms, and something happens, the new buyer is out there after a year or something, and there's problems with the septic system, they go and they look up what the septic permit says, and it says it's 3 bedrooms, but you advertised it as a 4 bedroom. So now this buyer who's having problems with their septic system comes back and they sue the listing agent, the listing agency, the seller, they sue everybody, right? And so this is one of the issues that is really critical, that we make sure that if you're selling a house as a 4 bedroom, that it's actually permitted to be a 4 bedroom house. Critical issue.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said that since it was a 4-bedroom home, you needed a 4-bedroom septic system? Why is that? To
Well,
meet the needs?
the septic system is designed with the idea that the number of bedrooms gives you an idea of how many people are in the house. So essentially they assume that if you have 3 bedrooms, you have 6 people living in the house. So the septic system is designed to accommodate 6 people doing their, daily ablutions. So if you've got a bigger house, you've got a family of, 12 living in the house, and you've now expanded the house a little bit, you've got 4 bedrooms, but the system wasn't designed for that many people. And so the tank won't hold all of that sewage, and it gets clogged up, and you end up with swampy backyard, which is really gross. So it's really important that the septic system matches, the occupants of the house. But they don't really know how many people are gonna live there, but they just use the number of bedrooms as sort of a guide for that. Does that make sense? And I've never lived in a house that had a septic system. Lots of people, out in the county have these. You have to have the tank pumped out every few years because it gets filled with sludge. And you have to, just have it checked out because stuff happens. Things break, the lines get roots growing into them and things like that. Yeah.
If it was just like a room added on, you couldn't change it to like 3-bedroom in a den or something like that?
Oh, you can call it whatever you like,
But
yeah.
you-
Certainly, if you're marketing it,
Okay.
you don't want to call it 4 bedrooms. You want to call it 3 bedrooms and a bonus, or 3
Okay.
bedrooms and a playroom, or 3 bedrooms and an office,
Okay.
right? Yeah, because it would be false advertising to call it 4 bedrooms,
Okay,
even though everybody looks at it and go, well, this looks like a bedroom to me,
right.
right? All right, probably another area that we deal with a lot is mold. I told you earlier, my across the street neighbor's dealing with this right now. And people will say to me, well, that's just a little mildew, it's not mold. So I'm like, well, okay, whatever. Whether you call it fungus, mold, mildew, it's all part of the kingdom fungi, and it's an issue. And it's basically where you have some moisture and something for the mold to grow on. Whether it's wood or it's paper. That's, you go under people's houses and they've stored their lumber underneath the house, or they've stored boxes of stuff in a closet, and they've had a leaky roof where stuff gets moldy. All it takes is just a little bit of moisture and something for the mold to grow on, and they can go crazy. Part of the problem is that there's always some mold. If you go underneath a house in Greensboro, especially the weather we've had recently, it's 100% humid, right? 100% humidity. So there's going to be moisture underneath the house, regardless of what kind of ventilation you have or any of that. So you may have some mold growing under the house. The question is, how much is too much, right? And that's a subjective judgment. You can have so much mold that it makes people sick, right? And you can't have that. I've been in houses where maybe the gutter system was, they had leaves all in the gutters and they were overflowing, and it was getting into the walls of the house. And there's black mold growing on the wall of the house, and they're like, so we walk into a bedroom or something, and you got this black mold growing on. I was like, what's going on with that? Oh, I don't know, it's been like that for a while. I'm not really sure what that is. I'm like, well, I can tell you what it is, it's mold, right? So, if you just wipe it off, a little Clorox on the wall, is that gonna do the trick? No, because on the other side of that sheetrock is probably full of mold. So the only way to deal with that is to tear that sheetrock out and clean it all out. So it can be a serious problem. But there is a lot of fear that sometimes can be overdone, where they'll find a little bit of mold underneath the house and people go, oh my gosh, we got to have this treated, it would cost thousands of dollars to have this. Or, in modern building standards, a lot of times they'll seal the crawl space, actually completely seal it, and they'll put a dehumidifier underneath the house. It's a great solution, but it's kind of expensive. And so you just have to, again, educate yourself so you know kind of what you're looking at. And if you are dealing with somebody who hasn't looked into their crawl space in a while, it might be that they need to have a home inspection or somebody to take a look under there and make sure they don't have all kinds of issues underneath the house. Termites, mold, foundation issues, all those kinds of things. The other thing that I found is simple things can make a big difference. If you have, for instance, the downspouts at the corners of the house, if they just end at the corner of the house and the water can go up underneath the house, then you end up with mold, or you end up with foundation issues because the ground is kind of squishy there, so the house settles in that squishy area. So a very simple fix is to get one of those black pipes that'll extend the downspout from you've got the gutters and then the downspout. You just get it away from the house, 2 or 3 feet away from the house, and you've solved the problem. The biggest cause of foundation issues is just water falling right at the edge of the house and making it squishy. But this mold issue can be the same as well. So if you've got a house, I've sold houses, for instance, that had a big hill in the backyard. So you got this kind of situation, right? Well, when it rains, the water is coming right down this hill. If they haven't done something to move the water around the house, then it's going to go under the house. So they'll do things like put in a French drain. They'll dig a ditch around the back of the house with drainage pipes underneath, and they'll cover that up with gravel and then cover it up with soil so that when it rains, the water goes into those pipes and then goes around the house. Simple solution, but if you don't do that and you end up with water going under the house, that's when you have issues like mold. I talked about the HVAC system a little bit, but if a lot of people don't understand how how air conditioning systems and heating systems work. One of the things that both of those do for us is to take the moisture out of the air. Have you ever walked into somebody's house and it was very cool but damp, kind of clammy? So if you have an air conditioning system, for instance, that's very efficient, so it cools the air down very quickly and then shuts off. Well, it didn't have time to take the water out of the air as well. If you've ever seen an air conditioning system, it has a condensate line that actually, as it cools the air, some of the water condenses out of the house and goes into this condensate line and runs out of the house. Well, if it's the middle of the summer and you don't have water dripping out of that condensate line, either your condensate line is is stocked up, or it's not doing an efficient job of taking the water out of the house. So you end up with a very humid house. It's perfectly cool, but it's clammy. And if that happens, you can have mold growing on the walls from that. And so having your air conditioning system checked by, professionals that know how to put those in. Does everybody know what a vapor barrier is underneath the house? Vapor barrier is a piece of plastic that goes under the house. So normally, in a crawl space underneath the house, you have dirt. And so they'll put a sheet of plastic down, and that keeps some of the moisture from coming up from the soil, and then either getting into the crawl space or even into the house over time. So mold is not a material fact unless it's excessive, unless it's too much. And how much is too much? I don't know. But you know when you see it. So CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980. This was the Superfund law that was passed in 1980, basically to help clean up these hazardous waste spots around the country. And the Superfund has cleaned up a lot of hazardous waste, but unfortunately it hasn't cleaned up all of them. In fact, they've had to go back and reissue. They started with $9 billion, and since then they've tripled that fund because it wasn't nearly enough. I don't know what's happening right this moment with this, but one of the things that this law helped to develop is a way to identify the responsible persons. Now, this possible responsible person, or PRP, could be the current owner, or it could be past owners. And so you could own a big chunk of land that has hazardous waste underneath it. Maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't. But you sold it 20 years ago, and guess what? You might be liable for the cleanup of that land. And they use these terms strict, meaning that if you are found to be a PRP, then you're responsible without excuse. Then you can't just say, well, I didn't have anything to do with this. I moved in here and I didn't know there was any hazardous waste under there. Too bad. Joint and several has to do with the fact that if there's 5 past owners and 4 of them have no money, guess who's going to have to pay for it? The 5th one, right? If those other owners can't pay, the 5th one can then turn around and sue the other 4 to eventually recoup his money. So they split it 5 ways or whatever they decide. But and it's retroactive, so they can go back and find people from 30 years ago. So it's kind of scary, really. That and if they find that you don't pay for it, and then they find that you're responsible, they can actually find you liable up to 3 times. So then it was reauthorized again years later, and they found that there were some mortgage companies that foreclosed on homes, and the mortgage companies complained, and the mortgage company banks have lots of money, and so they created a loophole that allows these banks to get out of having any responsibility, so the bank can't be a PRP. Essentially, if the pollution was caused by somebody else, if it was acquired after the fact, the landowner, meaning the bank, has no knowledge, and they did their due diligence and tried to figure out if there was any hazardous waste problems on this, but they didn't find any. and reasonable precautions were taken to, you know, exercise these ownership rights, then they can get out of becoming a PRP. Now, that doesn't usually apply to just, you know, everyday people like you and me, unfortunately. I did talk to an older gentleman about listing his land. He had this little piece of land off of Randleman Road. And I found out that he actually had a trucking company. And so because he had this trucking company, he also had big gasoline tanks or diesel tanks buried under the ground on this land. And I talked to him about that, and he said, well, he said, I'm not going to do anything about that. I'm just going to give it to my kids, let them worry about it. So basically, you know, he was just like shuttling it down the road a little farther. And, so there's some other legislation. I talked about the North Carolina Leaking Petroleum Underground Storage Tanks Cleanup Act, which we, you know, basically have defunded. The North Carolina Coastal Area Management Act is designed to protect and preserve the coastal areas. Places, you know, severe limitations on development, even though you'd never know it in some areas of the coast. Seems like they've just built forever there, but this is really critical if you're selling land on the east side of North Carolina, on the coastal areas. Large areas like wetlands, marshes have to be, you know, can be declared environmental concerns, and they have to be approved through a permitting process in order to build. Serious legal problems if you violate that. And then the Mountain Ridge Protection Act, this was the first law in the nation passed by a state to regulate the construction of protected mountain ridges. So there was a mountain ridge, Little Sugar Mountain, and in Avery County, and somebody wanted to build on top of the mountain, and so they said, well, you know, we're just building some little condos there. It's not going to be a big deal. But once they built them, they weren't just little condos. So the people that were, you know, had built these beautiful mountain homes, they overlook the other mountains, and they ended up having to look down on this giant condo associated on the top of a mountain, which these people had great views. The other people didn't have such great views anymore. And so they passed this Mountain Ridge Protection Act to try to keep us from having to look at giant condo associations. The North Carolina Dredge and Fill Act, this has to do with wetlands and areas that are inundated or saturated with water, to try to make sure that dredging and activities that stir up the soil don't end up getting into the streams and marshes, try to protect those. The Sediment Pollution Control Act, all of you have seen these little silt fencing and bundles that try to keep the runoff from getting into streams, try to control the erosion around construction sites. So all of that. So what does this have to do for us? The fact is that so if we don't disclose things, that's when we get in trouble. Appraisers, of course, they have to adjust for environmental issues when they're appraising as well. But for most of us, that's having to do with protecting the public from these environmental hazards and educating them as well. And so it's a material fact that we've got to make sure that we collect. So how do we find out about things? We ask around. We ask the owner. We look around. We might do an environmental site assessment. If you're doing commercial real estate, you're going to do this as a matter of course. to make sure there's not any environmental hazards or things that will impact the environment or the life around it. But any kind of material fact involving environmental hazards has to be disclosed. So, let's see. Any questions about any of that? Let's see. A method of sealing off disintegrating asbestos. What's that called? Good, encapsulation. Very good. Laying soil over the top of a landfill, planting vegetation to improve the look and prevent erosion is called capping. Capping. Good. Let's see. The most common source of lead poisoning found in residential property is in plumbing pipes, in the basement, caused by appliances, in alkyd oil-based paint. Yes, in the oil-based paint. True or false? Modern home construction reduces the potential for radon gas accumulation. False. Yeah, actually, homes are tighter, so there's not as much circulation in the house. You know, it used to be you just opened up all the windows. I mean, there's a lot of places now that they're really made to be sealed. And so you end up with accumulation of the radon gas rather than circulating it out of the house. I'm actually, as we speak, we're having new windows put on our house. And the guys are working there this afternoon. And at one point, they like rolled up on my old windows. He like pushed up this thing, which was the screen. I didn't even know that the screens would roll up like that. It was really pretty cool. But anyway, those windows are gone now. So when I get home, I'll have brand new windows. So exciting. Which of the following is or are colorless, odorless, and tasteless? Yeah, really all of them. Carbon dioxide we didn't talk about because carbon dioxide is, you know, all over. It's not really a problem unless you have nothing but carbon dioxide, in which case you'll suffocate. But carbon monoxide and radon are the two that we deal with most often. And those are both give us very little sign. What about natural gas? You can smell it. Yeah. Is natural gas naturally smelly? No, they actually put something in it so that we can smell it. And wasn't that stuff with the natural gas blowing up all those homes? Did you all read about that? Up in, was it Massachusetts or someplace? Like, they had an overpressurization of the natural gas in this whole neighborhood, basically. A bunch of homes blew up. Pretty scary. Have you had enough about environmental hazards? I think so. I have. Let's take a break. We'll come back. We're going to talk about Chapter 7. If you would, make sure that you check these answers. I'm going to put the Class 5 answers up here in just a minute as well. So this was the quiz and the homework from Class 4.